Picture this. You wake up one Tuesday morning to find 75 houses being built on your family's Texas ranch, and the HOA president is standing in your kitchen, coffee in hand, telling you it's perfectly legal. That's exactly what happened to Garrett Thornfield. After 6 weeks at his father's hospital bedside, he came home to the roar of diesel bulldozers tearing up prairie grass that had grown wild for over a century. The smell of fresh concrete mixed with mesquite smoke from his grandfather's old forge. Except now, there were McMansions, where cattle used to graze. But this blonde woman in designer workout clothes had the nerve to wave some papers at him and say, "Oh, honey, your daddy signed the development agreement. Didn't he tell you?" Spoiler alert, his father never signed anything, and by the time this story's over, Mother Nature herself would bulldoze every last one of those houses. What would you do if you found strangers building an entire subdivision on your land? Drop a comment about where you're watching from. I bet your HOA has some wild stories too. Meet Garrett "Rusty" Thornfield, 52 years old, third-generation rancher, and the kind of man who still believed a handshake meant something. His 847 acres of Texas hill country stretched from the old windmill that creaked like arthritic bones to the family cemetery, where 4 generations of Thornfields rested under ancient live oaks. Rusty had just buried his father the hard way. 6 weeks in a Houston hospital that reeked of industrial-strength disinfectant and despair. Cancer had eaten through the old man like acid through paper, leaving behind $340,000, 0 cents in medical bills, and a son who'd slept in plastic chairs for 42 straight nights. The ranch had been homesteaded in 1889, survived the Dust Bowl, and watched Austin creep closer, like a slow-motion invasion. Property taxes had tripled as McMansions sprouted like ugly mushrooms on neighboring farms. Rusty had been considering selling a back parcel, maybe 50 acres, to pay the medical bills and keep the legacy alive. He just never thought someone would steal it instead. Enter Vivian Ashworth Sterling, 48, a walking nightmare in Lululemon, who'd appointed herself president of Thornfield Estates, HOA. Picture every suburban Karen who ever demanded to speak to the manager, then multiply by 10 and add a law degree. This woman drove an $80,000 0 cents white Escalade with vanity plates that read, "Blessed One," and spoke like she'd swallowed a corporate handbook. Former Dallas real estate lawyer married to city councilman Bradley Sterling, the kind of politician who'd baptize his own grandmother if it got him votes. Vivian had that particular smile that said, "I went to private school," and "You're just trailer trash with acreage." The morning Rusty came home, she was standing in his kitchen like she owned it, which, according to her paperwork, she basically did. The woman had the balls to be drinking coffee from his father's favorite mug, the chipped ceramic one that said, "World's Best Dad" in faded letters. "Oh, honey," she purred without looking up from her iPhone, "your daddy signed the development agreement 2 years ago. Didn't he tell you?" She slid a stack of documents across his kitchen table, the cheap photocopies rough against his work-calloused palms. There was his father's signature, shaky and weak, dated during his worst chemo cycle, when the man thought the TV remote was a telephone. "That's impossible," Rusty said, his voice steady despite the fury building behind his ribs. "Dad would never—" "Sweetie, I understand you're grieving, but we have 75 families who've made legitimate investments." Her smile could have frozen the Gulf of Mexico. "They have rights too. More rights than some stubborn rancher who can't accept progress." The smell of her expensive perfume mixed with the lingering scent of his father's morning coffee, creating a nauseating cocktail that made his stomach turn. Rusty pulled out the original deed, the real one, with signatures in India ink that had survived droughts, floods, and the Great Depression. The parchment felt like silk between his fingers. "This land has been in my family for 134 years, he said. "And now it's going to house 75 beautiful families in a master-planned community with a golf course." She gathered her papers with practiced efficiency. "The permits are approved, construction is ahead of schedule, and frankly, your little cattle operation is an eyesore. I'd suggest you find somewhere else to live, preferably somewhere that appreciates rural charm." As she clicked across his grandfather's hand-laid hardwood floors and her designer heels, Rusty caught a glimpse of the construction site through his kitchen window. Orange safety vests moved between concrete foundations like worker ants, building dreams on stolen land. That's when he noticed the survey stakes. The bright orange markers that had defined his property line for decades were gone, replaced by new ones 200 feet closer to his house. Someone had literally moved his boundaries while he'd been watching his father die. This wasn't just theft, this was war. Vivian launched her first real attack exactly 72 hours after their kitchen meeting. A deputy sheriff showed up at Rusty's door carrying an eviction notice thick as a phone book, flanked by Marcus Webb city attorney Bradley Sterling's golf buddy and the kind of lawyer who charged $500 0 cents an hour to destroy families. Mrs. Ashworth Sterling has legitimate permits, Webb announced, his voice smooth as motor oil. You're technically trespassing on private property. We're offering 30 days to vacate voluntarily. The legal papers rustled like dead leaves in Rusty's calloused hands. Hidden in the bureaucratic language was an insult disguised as generosity. $50,000, 0 cents, for 847 acres of prime Texas real estate. Austin parking lots sold for more. Of course, Webb continued, straightening his $1,000 tie, if you choose to fight this, we'll have to explore tax complications with your father's estate, plus there's always eminent domain if this becomes a public safety issue. The deputy shifted uncomfortably. He'd probably bought cattle from the Thornfields. But Webb wasn't done. Oh, and Mrs. Ashworth Sterling wanted me to mention, she's received complaints about an unstable property owner threatening construction workers. Complete lie. Rusty had been nothing but civil, even when he'd found bulldozers on his land. But he was learning Vivian's playbook. Control the narrative. Control the outcome. After they left, the silence in his living room felt thick enough to cut with a knife. That's when Rusty made his first counter move. He called Dolores Martinez. Dolores had been county surveyor for 37 years, and at 67 she still had the sharpest eyes in 3 counties. More importantly, she hated corruption like a Baptist hates whiskey. Rusty found her in the courthouse basement, surrounded by file cabinets older than statehood, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like mechanical mosquitoes. Something stinks about this deal, she said, pulling out a manila folder. These permits were rubber-stamped during Christmas week, when half the planning commission was skiing in Colorado. She spread out the original survey maps, her weathered finger tracing boundary lines that had been solid for decades. Look here, someone moved your survey stakes 200 feet east. That's not just theft, honey, that's a third-degree felony. Here's your legal knowledge nugget. Always verify property boundaries with a licensed surveyor before any construction begins. Moving survey stakes is a felony in Texas, punishable by up to 10 years in prison. The takeaway? Document everything and never trust the other side's survey work. But Dolores had uncovered something bigger. She pulled out a folder marked Confidential Development Project Purchase Agreements for 12 properties surrounding Rusty's ranch, all bought by shell companies linked to Ashworth Development Group. Your neighbors didn't just sell cheap, Dolores explained, lighting a cigarette despite the no-smoking signs. They were scared into selling. Mysterious tax lien notices, threats of condemnation, intimidation tactics, all processed through Webb's law firm. The pattern was crystal clear, systematic theft disguised as development. Vivian had been circling Rusty's property like a vulture for 2 years, buying up surrounding land and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His father's cancer had been her golden opportunity. Then came the mini twist that changed everything. Here's the kicker, Dolores said, pulling out one final document. See this environmental impact study? Required for any development over 50 acres. Ashworth Development filed theirs 18 months ago, 6 months before your daddy supposedly signed anything. Rusty felt the blood drain from his face. They were planning this before Dad got sick. It's worse. The study lists your property as acquired and includes detailed plans for wetland mitigation. They've been telling investors they owned your land since day one. While Rusty was absorbing this bombshell, Vivian was busy playing victim. She'd organized a neighborhood petition claiming he was an unstable grieving widower and a danger to families. The local paper ran a story about the development dispute that painted him as a backwards rancher blocking progress. But Rusty's counterpunch was already in motion. That evening, he walked his property line with a GPS unit and camera, documenting every moved stake, every surveyor's mark, every piece of evidence. The air smelled like approaching rain and diesel exhaust from the construction site. a toxic mix that made his stomach turn. He photographed the original iron pins his great-grandfather had set in 1889, still exactly where they'd been planted. He documented the new orange stakes 200 feet inside his property line. Most importantly, he found something Vivian's crew had missed. The original concrete boundary marker from 1923, half buried under decades of soil but still bearing the Thornfield name. As thunder rumbled in the distance, Rusty realized he wasn't just fighting for his land anymore. He was fighting for every small property owner who'd ever been bullied by corrupt developers with political connections. And tomorrow, he was calling a lawyer of his own. Vivian's psychological warfare began at dawn on a Monday. She offered every displaced homeowner temporary, luxury accommodations, paid hotel suites, meal vouchers, even spa credits, but only if they signed on to a class action lawsuit against the unstable rancher blocking their American dream. Within 72 hours, she had 53 families convinced that Rusty Thornfield was a selfish monster standing between them and their forever homes. The local Facebook groups turned into digital lynch mobs, with posts calling him everything from greedy land hoarder to anti-family extremist. But Vivian's masterstroke was hiring Pinnacle Crisis Management, the same Dallas firm that had rehabilitated the reputations of disgraced oil executives. Suddenly, local news was running exposés about Rusty's financial instability, questioning whether a man drowning in medical debt could responsibly manage 847 acres. The humiliation reached its peak when Channel 8 ran a segment titled When Grief Becomes Greed, featuring interviews with tearful homeowners and footage of Rusty looking disheveled outside the courthouse. They even found his father's bankruptcy filing from 1987 during the farm crisis to suggest the family had a pattern of poor financial decisions. Then came the security theater. Vivian posted armed guards at every development entrance, ex-military contractors in tactical gear who looked like they were protecting a federal installation instead of a subdivision. The optics were perfect. Professional, concerned protectors versus one angry rancher. That's when Jake Kowalski showed up like an avenging angel in a beat-up Ford. At 34, Jake was the environmental lawyer Vivian hadn't seen coming. Raised on the neighboring farm until developers forced his family out, he'd crawled through law school on pure spite and scholarship money. Now he specialized in David versus Goliath cases, where corporate money trampled family legacies. "Heard you were having some trouble with entitled suburbanites," Jake said, stepping out of his truck with a legal briefcase held together by duct tape, but the documents inside could level mountains. They spread environmental surveys across Rusty's kitchen table, the same surface where Vivian had delivered her threats. The morning air carried the acrid smell of concrete dust mixed with the sweet scent of honeysuckle, trying to survive near the construction zone. "See this blue area?" Jake traced his finger across the wetland maps. 40% of Vivian's development sits on federally protected wetland. Building there without EPA permits isn't just illegal, it's an environmental felony with fines up to $50,000, 0 cents per day. Here's your environmental knowledge nugget. Wetlands are protected under the Clean Water Act, and any development requires federal permits that can take years to obtain. Violations trigger EPA investigations and criminal prosecution. The takeaway? Always check EPA wetland maps before any construction project. Ignorance isn't a legal defense. But Jake's nuclear option came when he pulled out the original 1889 land patent, yellow with age but legally ironclad. Your great-grandfather didn't just homestead the surface, Rusty. He claimed the mineral rights too. Oil, gas, everything underground. And your family never sold them. The mini twist hit like a freight train. Every foundation, septic system, and utility line was trespassing on Rusty's mineral rights. Vivian could claim the surface all she wanted, but she had zero legal authority to dig holes in his subsurface. "In Texas, you can own the surface and someone else can own what's underneath," Jake explained. "But in this case, you own both, which means every house she's built is sitting on stolen property." While they talked strategy, Jake's phone buzzed with messages from his growing coalition. Environmental groups were documenting habitat destruction, the Texas Wildlife Federation was filing federal complaints, even some homeowners were hiring their own lawyers after discovering their title insurance excluded subsurface conflicts. But the real bombshell came when Jake showed Rusty the County Planning Commission minutes from the approval meeting. Notice anything interesting about the attendance? Jake asked. 3 commissioners were marked absent, including the 2 who'd consistently voted against fast-track developments. The approval had passed 4-3, exactly the margin Vivian needed. Your buddy Bradley Sterling made some calls, Jake said, his voice dripping contempt. Promised the opposition future considerations if they missed this one little meeting. Classic political corruption, and we've got the phone records to prove it. That evening, they drove the property line documenting violations, the truck windows down to catch every sound and smell of the destruction. Construction debris choked the creek, where 4 generations of Thornfield cattle had watered. Concrete runoff had turned the stream milky white, and foundation work had destroyed an oak grove that predated the Civil War. She made one fatal mistake, Jake said as they watched bulldozers work under floodlights. She got greedy. Legal acquisition would have cost millions. Theft seemed cheaper. Until now, Rusty replied, watching his grandfather's fence posts disappear under suburban sprawl. Tomorrow they were going federal, and Vivian had no idea her empire was about to crumble. Vivian's desperation stank worse than a feedlot in August. When the environmental violations started making headlines, she pulled out every dirty trick in the playbook, starting with a petition to have Rusty declared mentally incompetent. The court filing was a masterpiece of character assassination, claiming his erratic behavior and financial desperation made him unfit to manage his own property. She'd hired a psychiatrist who'd never met Rusty to write an evaluation based on observable behavioral patterns consistent with grief-induced psychosis. But that was just the warm-up act. On a Thursday morning, Vivian's security team called 911, claiming Rusty had threatened construction workers with a shotgun. The responding deputies found him 2 miles away, fixing fence with his neighbor, but the damage was done. Channel 8 ran the story with footage of police cars and dramatic voiceovers about escalating tensions. Complete fabrication, but Vivian knew the truth was irrelevant once the cameras started rolling. Her financial warfare was even more vicious. The county tax assessor, another one of Bradley Sterling's golf buddies, suddenly discovered that Rusty's property should be classified as commercial development rather than agricultural land. Overnight, his tax bill jumped from $12,000, 0 cents, to $89,000, 0 cents, due in 30 days or face immediate seizure. It's just a coincidence, the assessor's office explained, that we're reviewing all properties in high-growth areas. Yeah, right, and the Easter Bunny was running for governor. The personal attacks cut deepest. Vivian started spreading rumors that Rusty's father had hidden gambling debts, that the medical bills were actually from private addiction treatment, that the family's financial problems ran deeper than anyone knew. Small-town gossip spreads faster than wildfire, and soon Rusty was getting suspicious looks at the feed store and awkward silences at the coffee shop. But while Vivian was busy playing dirty, Rusty and Jake were building their counterattack in silence. Jake had filed a federal complaint with the EPA that read like an environmental prosecutor's wet dream. Wetland destruction, illegal fill dumping, water pollution, 47 separate violations that could shut down the entire development and trigger criminal charges. The supporting evidence was devastating. Aerial photographs showing pristine wetland before construction, soil samples proving contamination, and expert testimony from hydrologists who explained how the development was destroying the regional watershed. Rusty spent his days documenting everything with the methodical patience of a man who'd spent decades watching cattle. Every morning, he walked the property line with a camera, recording the sound of diesel engines destroying century-old ecosystems. The air tasted like a mixture of concrete dust and diesel exhaust, with undertones of rotting vegetation where heavy machinery had churned wetland into mud. The local Ranchers Association had quietly organized a legal defense fund that grew bigger every day. Turns out a lot of folks had their own horror stories about developers using dirty tricks and political connections to steal family land. Here's something interesting, Jake said, spreading new documents across the kitchen table. I've been researching similar cases, and there's a pattern. Ashworth Development has pulled this exact scam in 4 other Texas counties. Here's your legal knowledge nugget. Property tax assessments can be challenged within 30 days of notification, and sudden reclassifications during disputes are often evidence of political corruption. The takeaway? Never ignore tax notices, and always request a formal hearing if your assessment seems suspicious. The mini twist came when Jake's private investigator friend uncovered Vivian's real plan. Hidden in the development company's investor documents was a geological survey showing potential oil and gas deposits worth an estimated $47 million. 0 cents. She never cared about houses, Jake explained, his voice tight with anger. The subdivision was always just a front. Once she had clear title, she was planning to sell the mineral rights to an energy company. Rusty felt like he'd been sucker punched. So, all those families are just useful idiots. Their deposits and construction loans were financing her mineral rights theft. While they absorbed this revelation, nature was preparing its own verdict. The National Weather Service had upgraded Hurricane Bethany to Category 3, with a track that put it on a direct collision course with central Texas. Meteorologists were calling it a once-in-a-generation storm that could bring unprecedented flooding to the hill country. The development sat directly in the hurricane's projected path, built in what old-timers knew was a historic floodplain. Rusty's grandfather had survived the Great Flood of 1952 by moving all his cattle to higher ground, the same high ground where the Thornfield house still stood. But 75 families in brand-new houses had no idea they were living in nature's bowling alley. That evening, Rusty stood on his porch watching the construction lights twinkle like false stars across his stolen land. The air smelled like approaching rain and impending justice. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a sound that had echoed across this prairie long before HOAs existed and would continue long after they were forgotten. Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, both meteorological and legal, and Vivian Ashworth Sterling was about to learn that some forces of nature can't be intimidated, bribed, or sued into submission. The secret that would destroy Vivian's empire was hiding in a safety deposit box that smelled like old leather and family secrets. Rusty found the key taped under his father's kitchen drawer, along with a note written in the shaky handwriting of a dying man. "Son, if you're reading this, that Sterling woman tried to steal what ain't hers. Box 247, First National. I caught her red-handed." The bank vault felt cold as a tomb. Inside, box 247 was a manila envelope thick enough to choke a horse. Geological surveys, mineral assessments, and legal documents his father had gathered like a dying detective, building one final case. "Holy shit," Jake breathed, reading the first page. "Your great-grandfather's 1889 land patent doesn't just grant mineral rights, it reserves all subsurface resources in perpetuity. Oil, gas, water, limestone, gravel, even underground storage rights." The Certified Geological Survey from 2019 made Rusty's knees weak. His father had commissioned it after getting suspicious about Vivian's repeated friendly visits. The professional assessment estimated shale oil deposits worth $127 million 0 cents, plus natural gas reserves that could generate royalties for decades. But the real bombshell was his father's handwritten margin notes. Sterling called again, offering $2 million, 0 cents for surface rights only. Asked 3 times if mineral rights were included. She knows something. The power dynamic had just exploded like a nuclear bomb. Every house in Vivian's development was trespassing on Rusty's mineral estate. Every foundation, septic line, and utility connection was an illegal intrusion into his subsurface property. "This changes everything," Jake said, his voice vibrating with excitement. "In Texas, mineral rights include reasonable surface access for extraction. You can legally force removal of any structure interfering with your subsurface ownership." Translation: Rusty could tear down every McMansion that stood in his way. But his father's masterpiece was the smoking gun hidden at the bottom of the envelope, a copy of Ashworth Development's secret partnership agreement with Lone Star Energy, dated 8 months before Vivian ever contacted the Thornfield family. The deal was already signed, $89 million 0 cents for exclusive drilling rights contingent only on acquisition of clear mineral title through adverse possession or voluntary sale. "Look at this clause," Jake said, his finger trembling with rage. "All residential structures will be demolished within 18 months of extraction commencement." She was planning to bulldoze their houses from day one. 75 families had mortgaged their futures to buy homes that Vivian intended to destroy the moment her oil deal closed. Their children's bedrooms, their retirement dreams, their life savings, all just collateral damage in a mineral rights heist. Here's your mineral rights knowledge nugget. Mineral estates can be more valuable than surface property, and in Texas, mineral owners have legal right to reasonable surface use for extraction. Always verify both surface and mineral ownership before any property purchase. The takeaway? That dream house means nothing if someone else owns what's underneath it. The final document was a letter from his father that made Rusty's throat close up. Son, I figured out Sterling's game when she kept asking about mineral rights. I was sick, not stupid. I let her think that forged signature fooled me while I built this case. She thinks she's stealing from a dying old man and his grieving boy. She has no idea she walked into a trap I spent 4 months setting. Every document you need is here. Make her pay for every acre of poisoned ground. Your great-great-grandfather would be proud. Dad? A taste of tears mixed with the metallic air of the bank vault as Jake started photographing evidence. The old man had fought cancer and corruption simultaneously, using his final months to construct Vivian's legal destruction. She thought she was robbing a defenseless widow. Instead, she'd stumbled into a minefield planted by a rancher who'd had nothing but time to plan her downfall. The trap was set. Now came the reckoning. Rusty's converted barn looked like a legal SWAT team had taken over a museum. County maps papered every wall, geological surveys carpeted the hay-covered floor, and laptops hummed with enough evidence to topple a small government. The sweet smell of old hay mixed with fresh coffee and determination thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake had assembled a dream team that would make Vivian's nightmares come true. Rebecca Chen arrived first, environmental scientist whose wetland expertise had sent 3 developers to federal prison and cost corrupt politicians their careers. She carried water sampling equipment that could detect contamination at the molecular level and EPA contacts who owed her favors. Marcus Webb drove down from Dallas with 40 years of petroleum geology experience and a briefcase full of mineral rights cases that had generated billion-dollar settlements. Not to be confused with the corrupt city attorney, this Marcus specialized in making oil companies pay fair prices for what they stole. Dolores Martinez brought 4 decades of county records and a memory that could shame a computer. I've been documenting developer corruption since before you were born, she announced, lighting a cigarette despite the fire hazard. This is my masterpiece. The War Council convened around a folding table that groaned under the weight of evidence. Outside, construction equipment rumbled like mechanical thunder, a constant reminder of the empire they were about to destroy. We hit them with coordinated legal strikes, Jake explained, spreading documents like a general planning D-Day. Federal environmental crimes, mineral rights trespass, criminal fraud, and civil damages for every family they've defrauded. Rebecca's environmental assault was surgical in its precision. EPA violations would trigger automatic construction shutdowns within 48 hours. Water contamination evidence would bring federal criminal charges. Wetland destruction fines could reach $50,000, 0 cents per day, accumulating until Ashworth Development bled to death financially. Here's what civilians don't understand about environmental law, Rebecca said, pulling out photographs of pristine wetlands transformed into toxic mud. Federal violations aren't civil matters. They're criminal cases with prison sentences. Here's your environmental knowledge nugget. EPA wetland violations trigger mandatory federal prosecution and can result in both corporate fines and personal criminal liability for executives. Environmental crimes carry sentences up to 5 years per violation. The takeaway? Environmental regulations have teeth. Violate them at your own risk. Marcus's mineral rights strategy was even more devastating. Every foundation, septic system, and utility line was trespassing on Rusty's subsurface estate. Under Texas law, he could demand immediate removal of all structures interfering with mineral extraction rights. Mineral estate dominance is absolute, Marcus explained, showing cross-sections of underground resources worth more than some small countries. Surface owners can't prevent reasonable access to subsurface assets. The financial mathematics were staggering. Chesapeake Energy had been circling the region like vultures, offering $15,000, 0 cents per acre signing bonuses plus 20% royalties on production. Rusty's 847 acres could generate $12,700,000, 0 cents immediately, plus decades of royalty payments. Here's your mineral rights knowledge nugget. In Texas, mineral estates are legally dominant over surface estates, meaning subsurface owners can access their resources even if it disrupts surface activities. Professional appraisals typically value mineral rights at 3-10 times surface value in proven oil regions. The takeaway? Always hire petroleum geologists and energy attorneys for mineral rights negotiations. Amateurs get robbed. But Jake's media strategy was pure genius. Instead of fighting Vivian's PR machine, they were going to let her destroy herself with the truth. Environmental groups have been waiting for a story like this, Rebecca said, scrolling through contacts that included senators, documentary filmmakers, and investigative reporters. Corrupt developers stealing family ranches to drill oil wells. This goes national within 24 hours. The timeline was aggressive, but achievable. EPA complaints Monday morning would shut down construction by Wednesday. FBI referrals would follow by Friday, with federal grand jury subpoenas the following week. Civil lawsuits representing 75 defrauded families would bankrupt Ashworth Development within a month. Dolores had been building grassroots support that would make Vivian's political connections worthless. The Ranchers Association Defense Fund had reached $200,000, 0 cents. Environmental groups were planning protests that would attract national media. Even conservative county commissioners were distancing themselves from the Sterling corruption scandal. Here's the beautiful part, Dolores said, stubbing out her cigarette on a metal bucket. When county officials realize they approved a development that violates federal law, they'll sacrifice Bradley and Vivian faster than rattlesnakes shed skin. While they planned legal Armageddon, Rusty was preparing for Hurricane Bethany's arrival. He'd moved his cattle to the same high pastures where his grandfather had saved the herd during the historic 1952 flood. The family cemetery was sandbagged, the old windmill reinforced, and emergency supplies stockpiled. Category 4 hurricane, 36 hours out, Rebecca announced, checking weather radar that showed a perfect storm bearing down on central Texas. This development is going to be underwater before our lawsuits hit court. Mother Nature was about to deliver her own verdict on Vivian's stolen empire, and unlike human justice, natural justice couldn't be bribed, corrupted, or appealed. Vivian's desperation peaked at exactly 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday when she showed up at Rusty's door with a briefcase full of cash and the dead-eyed stare of someone whose empire was crumbling in real time. $2 million, she announced, setting the metal case on his porch like she was delivering a pizza. Cashier's checks, all legal, no strings attached. Sign this quitclaim deed and disappear. The morning air carried the acrid smell of diesel exhaust from construction equipment that had been working around the clock, trying to finish foundations before the EPA could shut them down. Vivian's designer workout clothes looked slept in, and her perfectly coiffed hair showed gray roots that hadn't been touched up in weeks. Not interested, Rusty said, not even looking at the money. $5 million, she countered immediately. Cash wire transfer anywhere you want it. Cayman Islands, Switzerland, crypto, I don't care. Just sign the fucking papers and go away. The profanity was new. Vivian's corporate polish was cracking like old paint, revealing the desperate criminal underneath. But Rusty had learned something important from his father. Never interrupt your enemy when they're destroying themselves. When bribery failed, Vivian escalated to sabotage with the subtlety of a chainsaw massacre. Wednesday night, someone cut the power lines feeding Rusty's house, leaving him without electricity during the hottest week of summer. Thursday morning, his water well pump mysteriously died after unknown contaminants appeared in the system. The damage looked professional, too clean for random vandalism, too convenient for coincidence. But Vivian had underestimated Jake's paranoia. Hidden trail cameras captured everything, her security contractors using bolt cutters on power lines, pouring industrial solvent into the well casing, even trying to contaminate his cattle's water supply. Here's your smoking gun, Jake said, reviewing footage that could have come from a crime documentary. Criminal mischief, sabotage of utilities, attempted poisoning of livestock. These are felony charges. But Vivian's media blitz was her masterpiece of manipulation. She hired Pinnacle Crisis Management, the same Dallas firm that had whitewashed oil spills and congressional sex scandals, to paint Rusty as an eco-terrorist blocking American energy independence. The narrative was poisonous in its brilliance, a radical environmentalist using frivolous lawsuits to prevent job creation and economic development. Local talk radio picked up the story. Then Fox News ran a segment about environmental extremists destroying rural communities. He's holding 75 families hostage, Vivian told Channel 8, standing in front of construction equipment with tears in her eyes that looked almost real. These are teachers, nurses, police officers, hardworking Americans who just want homes for their children. The social media campaign was surgical. Bots amplified every negative comment about environmental regulations. Fake accounts posted photographs of Rusty looking angry or disheveled, always with captions about radical leftist agenda and anti-business extremism. While Vivian played victim, Rusty and Jake were building an unstoppable legal avalanche in complete silence. Jake had filed 47 separate environmental violations with the EPA, each one documented with professional photographs, soil samples, and expert testimony. The evidence was overwhelming: wetland destruction, water contamination, illegal dumping, and habitat destruction that violated 6 different federal laws. EPA investigators arrived Monday morning, Jake announced, showing Rusty emails from federal agents who were salivating over the case. Criminal Environmental Investigation Division, the guys who send executives to federal prison. Here's your environmental law knowledge nugget. EPA criminal investigations can result in both corporate fines and personal prison sentences for executives who knowingly violate environmental regulations. Criminal penalties include up to 5 years per violation plus asset forfeiture. The takeaway? Environmental crimes are serious federal offenses. Executives can't hide behind corporate protection. The mineral rights documentation was even more devastating. Marcus had cataloged every structure built over Rusty's subsurface estate. 75 houses, 150 septic systems, 12 miles of utility lines, plus a planned golf course that would require massive excavation. Total trespass damages exceed $40 million, 0 cents, Marcus calculated, showing spreadsheets that would make Vivian's accountants weep. Plus punitive damages for willful violation of clearly documented mineral rights. But Hurricane Bethany was nature's trump card, building strength over the Gulf of Mexico like a biblical judgment bearing down on central Texas. Category 4 winds, unprecedented rainfall, and storm surge that would test every structure within 50 miles of the coast. The development sat in what emergency planners called a perfect flood zone. Natural drainage from 3 watersheds converging exactly where Vivian had built her empire. Weather models showed potential flooding that could rival the historic 1952 deluge that had shaped the region's geography. Mandatory evacuations start Friday, Rebecca announced, monitoring hurricane tracking that looked like a target painted on Vivian's subdivision. But here's the kicker: most homeowners' insurance excludes flood damage in high-risk areas. 75 families were about to lose everything they'd invested in, houses that should never have been built in America's bowling alley, and Vivian would be legally liable for every penny of their losses. Justice was 36 hours away, arriving with 150 mph winds and enough water to wash away every trace of corruption. Hurricane Bethany was 18 hours out when Vivian made her final desperate gambit, a move so audacious it would have impressed Satan himself. At 3 a.m. Friday morning, she convinced the county emergency coordinator to issue a preemptive safety evacuation for Thornfield Estates, claiming that an unstable property owner with a history of threats posed immediate danger to residents during the approaching storm. Sheriff's deputies knocked on doors, telling terrified families they had 4 hours to evacuate because of credible threats from a disturbed individual. The evacuees were offered luxury hotel accommodations in Austin, paid for by Ashworth Development, but only if they signed emergency waivers absolving the company of responsibility for weather damages. The media circus was immediate and overwhelming. Every TV station ran footage of families loading SUVs with children, pets, and hastily packed belongings, while Vivian played the role of concerned protector. "We cannot risk innocent lives because one man refuses to accept progress," she told reporters, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. But her legal nuclear option was even more vicious. Through emergency court channels, she filed for immediate eminent domain seizure, claiming Rusty's property posed imminent public safety hazards that required government intervention. The petition claimed his deteriorating mental state and anti-development terrorism justified emergency seizure under disaster response protocols. The paperwork was filed at 11 p.m. Thursday night, designed to prevent Rusty from mounting legal opposition before the hurricane hit. By Friday morning, county bulldozers were positioning outside his property line, ready to secure the area for public safety. "She's trying to steal your land using the hurricane as cover," Jake explained, his voice tight with fury. "Emergency powers let local governments bypass normal legal procedures, but only for legitimate public safety." While Vivian manipulated the emergency response system, Rusty's counter-preparation was reaching completion with military precision. Jake had assembled a media army that would make Vivian's PR firm look like amateur hour. Environmental groups brought national reporters who specialized in corporate corruption. Documentary filmmakers arrived with equipment that could capture evidence in hurricane conditions. Even a Netflix crew showed up after Rebecca leaked the story about mineral rights theft and environmental destruction. "This goes national in 6 hours," Rebecca announced, coordinating with journalists who understood they were witnessing David versus Goliath in real time. CNN, MSNBC, even Fox News wants the environmental crime angle. The legal preparation was even more impressive. Jake had filed emergency injunctions with 3 different federal courts, each one designed to stop different aspects of Vivian's scheme. EPA investigators were driving down from Dallas with enough federal authority to arrest everyone, from Vivian to the county commissioners. "Federal law trumps local emergency powers," Jake explained, showing Rusty court orders that could override any county seizure attempt. "Environmental crimes don't disappear just because there's a hurricane coming. Here's your emergency powers knowledge nugget. Local governments can use emergency authority only for legitimate public safety, not to benefit private developers or resolve civil disputes. Emergency seizures require clear evidence of immediate danger, not speculation about property owner behavior. The takeaway? Emergency powers have strict legal limits. Abuse of disaster authority is a federal crime." But Mother Nature was preparing the ultimate judgment with mathematical precision. Hurricane Bethany had strengthened to Category 4+, packing 165 mph winds and carrying enough water to rewrite the regional geography. Weather models showed the storm's eye passing directly over the development, with storm surge that could put the entire subdivision under 15 feet of water. The topography told the story that Vivian's engineers had ignored. Rusty's property sat on a ridge that had been high ground since the last ice age, elevated above 3 different creek systems that drained surrounding hills. The development occupied the natural floodplain where centuries of storms had deposited sediment and carved drainage channels. "Your great-grandfather knew exactly what he was doing when he built here," Marcus said, studying geological surveys that read like a prediction of disaster. "This ridge has never flooded because it's literally above the storm drainage system." As afternoon thunderstorms began building ahead of the hurricane's arrival, Rusty walked his property line one final time, documenting the systematic destruction of 4 generations of conservation work. The air tasted like ozone and impending justice, thick with humidity that made his shirt stick to his skin like a second layer of determination. Construction lights glittered across the stolen landscape like false stars, illuminating houses that had been built in nature's crosshairs. Diesel generators hummed their mechanical death songs while workers desperately tried to secure structures that should never have been constructed in America's bathtub. The community that had rallied around Rusty's fight was preparing its own response. Local ranchers had formed protective cordons around his property. Citizen journalists were live-streaming every development, and environmental activists were preparing to document whatever Hurricane Bethany revealed about wetland destruction and illegal construction. 24 hours from now, the truth would be underwater, and Vivian's empire would be scattered across 3 counties like the debris it had always been. The reckoning was here. The showdown happened at 2 p.m. Friday afternoon in the county courthouse, with Hurricane Bethany's outer bands already lashing the building with rain that sounded like a machine gun fire against the windows. Every seat in the emergency session courtroom was packed with an audience that read like a casting call for American justice. Displaced homeowners clutching evacuation notices, environmental activists with cameras, ranchers in their Sunday best, and enough reporters to staff a small newspaper. The air crackled with tension thick enough to cut with a chainsaw. Judge Patricia Hendricks had called the emergency hearing after Jake filed federal injunctions that threatened to override local authority. Sitting behind the bench like a referee in a heavyweight championship, she looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on the planet. Vivian entered, flanked by 3 lawyers in $1,000 suits, her blonde hair still perfectly styled despite the chaos. She'd traded her workout clothes for a Navy business suit that screamed responsible executive, protecting innocent families. Her confidence radiated like heat from asphalt, even as 165 PMPF winds approached from the southeast. "Your Honor," her lead attorney began, "Mrs. Ashworth Turling is simply trying to protect 75 families from a disturbed individual whose behavior has escalated to threats and property destruction." Complete lies, but delivered with courtroom polish that had convinced juries for decades. Rusty sat with Jake at the defendant's table, wearing his best flannel shirt and the kind of calm that comes from holding nuclear weapons. Behind them, Dolores Martinez clutched a briefcase full of county records while Marcus Webb reviewed geological surveys that could rewrite property law. Then the federal cavalry arrived. EPA criminal investigation agent Sarah Martinez entered the courtroom like an avenging angel in a government windbreaker, followed by 2 FBI agents and a federal prosecutor who looked hungry for white-collar scalps. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees, as everyone realized this had escalated beyond local politics. "Your Honor," Agent Martinez announced, "the federal government has evidence of environmental crimes that require immediate intervention." She placed a stack of documents on the judge's bench, thick enough to stop bullets. Water contamination reports, illegal dumping evidence, wetland destruction photographs, enough federal violations to send Vivian to prison until her great-grandchildren graduated college. But Jake's mic drop moment was pure theater. "Your Honor," he said, standing with the confidence of a man holding royal flush, "I'd like to present evidence that Mrs. Ashworth Sterling's entire development is built on property she never legally owned." He handed Judge Hendricks the original 1889 land patent, the mineral rights documentation, and the smoking gun that would end Vivian's empire forever. Her secret partnership agreement with Lone Star Energy, showing she'd planned to demolish every house from day one. The courtroom erupted like a nuclear explosion. Homeowners started shouting questions about their investments. Reporters began typing frantically. Environmental activists cheered, and Vivian's face went white as fresh snow. "Ms. Ashworth Sterling," Judge Hendricks said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a scalpel, "did you represent to buyers that you had clear title to this property?" "We followed all legal procedures," Vivian stammered, her corporate polish cracking like old paint. "That's not what I asked," the judge replied. "Did you know that Mr. Thornfield held mineral rights that would prevent permanent residential construction?" The courtroom held its breath. Through the windows, hurricane winds howled like banshees as nature prepared to deliver its own verdict. "Mrs. Ashworth Sterling," Agent Martinez interjected, "you have the right to remain silent." That's when Vivian finally broke. "You don't understand," she screamed, abandoning 20 years of corporate training. "That old man was sitting on a fortune, $89 million in oil reserves, and he was going to waste it on cattle and sentiment. Those people deserved better homes than some backwards ranch." The confession echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Every reporter, every homeowner, every witness heard her admit to systematic fraud, mineral rights theft, and environmental destruction, all captured on live television as Hurricane Bethany approached with biblical fury. Furthermore, Agent Martinez announced, federal warrants have been issued for Mrs. Ashworth Sterling and City Councilman Bradley Sterling on charges of conspiracy, fraud, environmental crimes, and violation of federal wetland protection laws. As federal agents moved to arrest Vivian, the lights flickered and rain began hammering the courthouse windows harder. Outside, emergency sirens wailed as Hurricane Bethany's landfall approached, the exact coordinates where 75 houses had been built in nature's crosshairs. Judge Hendricks banged her gavel above the chaos. "Federal injunction granted. All construction immediately halted. Emergency evacuation procedures will proceed under federal supervision." But Mother Nature had already rendered her own verdict. Through the courthouse windows, everyone could see the first tornado funnel forming directly over Thornfield Estates, as if the sky itself was reaching down to erase every trace of corruption from the Texas landscape. Justice was arriving with 165 mf winds and enough water to wash away 30 years of political corruption. The reckoning had begun. Hurricane Bethany delivered justice with the precision of a divine accountant settling cosmic debts. When the storm passed 36 hours later, Thornfield Estates looked like God's own demolition crew had worked overtime. 75 McMansions were reduced to concrete foundations and scattered dreams. The golf course had become a temporary lake filled with luxury appliances and Range Rovers. Vivian's sales office was found 3 miles away, wrapped around an oak tree like a giant's discarded napkin. But Rusty's ranch stood untouched on the high ground where his great-grandfather had built it, the old windmill still creaking in the post-storm breeze like a metronome marking time for 4 generations of survival. The human aftermath was swift and satisfying. Vivian Ashworth Sterling received 18 months in federal prison for environmental crimes, plus $47 million, 0 cents in restitution to defrauded homeowners. Bradley Sterling resigned from city council and lost his law license, ending a political career built on corruption and country club handshakes. The County Planning Commission was disbanded after FBI investigations revealed systematic bribery spanning 2 decades. 3 commissioners received prison sentences, and new ethics laws required public disclosure of all development relationships. But the real victory was community healing that spread like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Rusty used his mineral rights lease signing bonus, $12,700,000, 0 cents from Chesapeake Energy, to establish the Thornfield Conservation Trust, a scholarship fund for rural kids studying environmental law. The ranch became a field station for Texas A&M's conservation program, where students learned to balance economic development with environmental protection. Education is the only way to prevent this from happening again, Rusty explained to the first class of scholarship recipients, standing in the restored wetland where houses had briefly interrupted a century of natural harmony. The displaced families found their own justice through Jake's class action lawsuit that forced Ashworth Development's insurance companies to pay full replacement value for their destroyed homes. Most families relocated to properly planned communities with honest developers and flood insurance that actually covered flood damage. Here's your final knowledge nugget. Always verify that developers carry adequate insurance and bonding before purchasing in new developments. Legitimate developers welcome insurance verification because they have nothing to hide. The takeaway? If a developer won't show you their insurance coverage, run away faster than a roadrunner from a coyote. The environmental restoration became a model for conservation groups across Texas. The wetland system, freed from concrete and septic contamination, rebounded with remarkable speed. Within 18 months, migratory birds had returned, native fish populations recovered, and the water quality exceeded pre-development standards. Rebecca Chen led the restoration effort with the passion of someone who'd watched too many ecosystems destroyed by greed. "This proves that nature can heal if we give her the chance," she said, standing knee-deep in clear water where construction debris had once poisoned the landscape. The annual Wetland Days Festival became a celebration that drew visitors from across the region. Local artisans sold crafts, environmental groups educated families about conservation, and Rusty told the story of how one hurricane had washed away 30 years of corruption. "Sometimes Mother Nature is the best lawyer money can't buy," became his standard closing line, always generating applause from audiences who understood that justice doesn't always come from courtrooms. The conservation easement Rusty placed on his property ensured that 847 acres of Texas hill country would remain undeveloped forever, protected by legal language stronger than any fence. His father's grave in the family cemetery looked out over grassland that would stay wild for centuries, exactly as 5 generations of Thornfields had intended. On quiet evenings, Rusty could stand on his grandfather's porch and hear sounds that predated HOAs, city councils, and corporate corruption. Meadowlarks calling across native grass, cattle lowing in the distance, and the eternal creak of the windmill that had pumped water through drought, flood, and the kind of human storms that test everything worth preserving. The next episode of Justice was already in production. Jake had taken on a case involving an HOA that banned vegetable gardens, while the board secretly sold approved plants at 400% markup. But that's a story for another day. "Drop a comment about your worst HOA experience," Rusty said into the camera during his final interview. "We might feature your story next, because corruption thrives in darkness but dies in sunlight." Hit that subscribe button if you believe the little guy can still win when he's got the truth on his side. And remember, sometimes the best revenge is just letting Mother Nature do what she does best. The land endures, the truth endures, and justice, like the Texas wind, never stops blowing.